You know, I got to say, for a while, I thought I had the markets all figured out.
Oh, yeah.
History was just going to repeat itself.
Mm-hmm.
I even lost some money thinking I'd cracked the code.
Yeah. It's humbling, isn't it?
It really is. Talk about a reality check.
Absolutely.
But that's kind of what we're digging into today, right? This idea that we can't predict everything.
Right. And that's where psychology comes in.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we're going with Morgan Housel's The Psychology of Money.
Good one.
He's got this line that's so simple, but it really makes you think. He says, things that have never happened before happen all the time.
It's so true. And it's something a lot of investors forget.
It's like we get so focused on spotting those historical patterns that we miss what's actually new.
Yeah, we try to fit everything into neat little boxes based on what we've seen before, but the world doesn't always cooperate, does it?
It really doesn't. And that's where I think a lot of us fall into that historians as prophets trap.
Yeah.
Thinking if we study the past long enough, we'll be ready for anything.
Like we can predict the future by just looking in the rearview mirror?
Exactly. But markets don't work like that. People don't work like that.
Because there's so much more going on than just numbers and charts, right?
Absolutely. It's emotions. It's psychology.
It's millions of individual decisions all colliding at once.
Imagine if you could somehow predict every one of those decisions.
Laughs. Yeah, good luck with that.
It's like trying to do physics, but with feelings thrown into the mix.
Well, there's a thought. Richard Feynman, the physicist, once said, imagine if electrons had feelings.
No kidding.
He said, it would be much harder to do physics.
Can you imagine?
Yeah. Well, the market doesn't care about our struggles, does it?
Not one bit.
No.
And you know what? Those feelings with it, those are the real wild cards.
Absolutely. They drive some of the biggest market swings, both up and down.
Greed, fear, you name it. We can't forget those.
And we can't forget that those things are inherently unpredictable.
So if history's not a crystal ball, which is kind of a bummer, how do we even begin to get ready for those things that have never happened before, especially the big ones? You know, the outliers that Housel says can completely reshape the world as we know it.
Right. Those are the events that make you realize just how much is outside our control.
Okay, so let's talk about those outliers for a second, because that's where my brain starts to hurt a little.
It's mind-bending stuff for sure.
So Housel, he gives this example, right? Like imagine if you took certain people out of the picture entirely.
Okay, yeah.
He's talking about major figures. Hitler, Stalin even throws in Thomas Edison and Bill Gates.
People who shaped the course of history.
And not always in a good way, obviously. But his point is, these weren't like preordained figures, you know?
Right, like their existence wasn't inevitable.
Exactly. It's kind of wild to think about.
It really makes you realize how much impact a single life can have.
So you're telling me if just one person had made a different choice,
or if circumstances had unfolded differently,
the whole world could look totally different today.
Potentially, yeah. It's a bit of a mind-bending thought experiment.
It really is. And it's not just about these big historical figures, right?
Well, definitely.
It's the ripple effects, too.
Exactly. Like, think about the invention of the internet for a second.
Okay, yeah.
If that hadn't happened,
Completely different ballgame.
your life would be completely different right now.
No doubt about it. And then there are those events that nobody saw coming,
The ones that change everything overnight.
like the fall of the Berlin Wall,
Or 9/11.
major turning points in history.
And those events, they weren't inevitable either.
They were surprises
Driven by a complex web of factors.
that nobody could have possibly predicted.
And yet they continue to shape the world we live in.
So where does that leave us?
Yeah.
Then how do we plan for the future?
Well, that's where Housel shifts gears a bit.
Okay, I'm listening.
He says we need to look at history a little differently.
So not as a crystal ball,
Not exactly. He argues that it's still incredibly valuable.
but for a different reason.
It's not about predicting the future.
It's about understanding human behavior.
Yeah.
Okay, I can get behind that. So what kind of patterns are we talking about?
Well, think about market bubbles and crashes for a second.
Okay, those are classic.
They happen again and again throughout history.
Tulipmania, the dot-com bubble.
Exactly. And while the specific circumstances might be different each time,
Right. Each one has its own quirks.
the underlying drivers are often the same.
Greed, fear,
The herd mentality.
those classic human emotions.
And those things, they're not going anywhere.
So even though we can't predict the next crash,
We can at least be aware of the pattern.
the emotional currents that tend to drive these events.
Exactly. And that brings us to a fascinating example that Housel uses,
Let's hear it.
Benjamin Graham.
Oh, you mean the intelligent investor himself.
That's the one, the OG of value investing.
His book's still a must-read for investors today.
Absolutely. Full of timeless wisdom.
But here's the interesting thing.
Even Graham himself admitted that markets evolve.
Really?
He said that some of the formulas he provided in his book,
Formulas he's famous for.
they simply don't work the same way today.
You're telling me that even Benjamin Graham's strategies had an expiration date?
It's true, and it highlights a really important point.
Which is,
The financial landscape is constantly changing.
so if even Graham's strategies needed tweaking, how do we know when the rules of the game have really changed?
Yeah, that's the $1,000,000 question, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
We've all heard that phrase, "it's different this time,"
Oh, yeah?
usually followed by a big eye roll.
Rightfully so. It's almost become a cliche.
Totally. But here's the thing. Housel points out that sometimes it actually is different.
He does. And he uses a great example.
Lay it on me.
John Templeton, another investing legend.
Oh, yeah, Templeton. He's the real deal.
So Templeton actually said those words, "It's different this time."
He did.
He said those very words are dangerous.
Okay, so he gets it.
He does. But then he follows that up by saying that markets really do change about 20% of the time.
Wow. Okay, so 1 out of every 5 times the rule book gets thrown out the window.
Something like that.
I guess that's where things get really tricky.
It's the challenge of separating hype from genuine change.
Figuring out when it's not just history repeating itself, but something totally new.
Exactly. And that's a question we should all be asking ourselves.
So how do we do that? How do we know when we're facing a true paradigm shift?
Well, that's where things get really interesting.
All right, I'm ready. Let's hear it.
Because it requires us to think critically about the world around us.
Okay, makes sense.
It's not enough to just look at charts and graphs.
Right, got to look beyond the numbers.
Exactly. We need to be asking ourselves, what are the underlying forces that are shaping the financial landscape right now?
What are those big trends, those game changers that are going to rewrite the rules?
The things that even someone like Benjamin Graham might not have anticipated.
Okay, so if we're not treating history as a crystal ball, what's the takeaway? How should we be using it?
Housel gives us a great analogy.
All right, I love a good analogy.
He says to think of history as a compass, not a map.
Okay, so it's about getting our bearings, not turn-by-turn directions.
Exactly. It won't tell us exactly where to go,
Right.
but it can help us understand the broader context.
The currents that have shaped the financial world for centuries.
Exactly. It's about understanding those timeless principles, those enduring patterns of human behavior.
Recognizing that fear, greed, hope, they've always been major players in the market.
And they're not going away anytime soon.
So it sounds like the real skill is learning to balance that historical knowledge.
With a healthy dose of humility.
Right, because the world's going to find ways to surprise us.
It always does.
And assuming we've got it all figured out, well, that's a recipe for disaster, isn't it?
It can be. That's why it's so important to stay curious, to stay open to new ideas.
And never stop learning and adapting.
Exactly. Because the financial world is constantly evolving.
And so are we. Well said. It's been a fascinating deep dive today.
My pleasure as always.
And for everyone listening, we'll leave you with this. What's one significant way you think the financial world is truly different today from even the recent past?
What's changed in a way that maybe even Benjamin Graham couldn't have predicted?
It's a question worth pondering. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and as always, happy diving.
Thanks for tuning in to Becoming a Millionaire in 5 years. Remember, every small step you take today brings you closer to your millionaire goals. If you found value in today's video, please give us a thumbs up and share it with someone who's also ready to change their financial future. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Together, let's turn those dreams into reality. See you next time.